The Silent Rich Man of Kawere, The Mystery Behind Chief Nkete's House, A Complete African Story, Section 1, A Man Who Walked Beneath the Cloud. The places in this world that ordinary maps refuse to show. Not because the people who drew those maps were careless, but because some places do not want to be found. Some places choose who enters and who stays out. Some places breathe, and the breath they carry is older than anything living inside them. Kawere was one of those places. It sat between endless forests and ancient hills that had no names anyone still remembered. The hills rose and fell like the chest of a sleeping giant, and the forests between them were so thick even light had to negotiate its way through the branches before reaching the ground below. To arrive in Kawere, you had to know the way, and to know the way someone who belonged to Kawere had to show you. Strangers who tried to find it on their own were almost always ended up somewhere else, standing confused at the edge of a stream they had never seen before, with the feeling that the village had simply moved out of their path. The elders say the soil beneath Kawere remembered every footstep that had ever touched it. They say the winds carried conversations from the past, arguments between people who had been dead for generations, laughters from celebrations nobody living could name. They say that on certain nights, the crowds gathered directly above the village and formed shape that stories to those who knew how to read them. Most people listened to the elders, nodded carefully, and chose not to think too deeply about any of it. During the day, Kawere looked any other life feeling. Children chase each other through the path between the houses, their voices rising and falling like music with a composer. Farmers moved slowly and deliberately through gardens that smelled of wet earth and growing things. Women gathered around evening fires while the sun was still descending, their conversations weaving together with the smoke that rose between them. It was warm, it was alive, it was the kind of place that made visitors breathe more slowly without realizing they were doing it. But when the darkness came, and in Kawere, darkness did not simply arrive, it arrived with intention. Everything changed. Doors closed earlier than necessary. Voices dropped to murmurs. Children who had been running wild all afternoon were suddenly gathered inside before their mothers had to call them twice. And every person who lived in Kawere, from the youngest child who had just learned to walk to the oldest elder whose eyes had seen almost everything this life could offer, observed one unspoken rule without fail. Nobody walked near the northern forest after the sun went down. There was a reason for that rule. At the very edge of the village, standing on a lonely hill that the tall trees leaned away from as though granting it space out of respect, was a house. It was not simply a large house. It was a house that demanded your intention and attention from a distance and refused to release it when you looked away. It had gates made from dark wood, so old that the wood had turned almost black, carved with patterns that shifted slightly depending on where you stood. When you looked at them, the walls were thick and the colors of deep earth after heavy rain. The windows were tall but narrow, and they were always closed. Even during the brightest hours of a clear afternoon, when every other house in the village had its windows open to catch the breeze, those windows remained shut. Nobody knew when the house had been built. Nobody alive could remember time before it existed. Nobody could say with certainty who had designed it or why it had been placed on the particular hill above the particular part of the village, overlooking the northern forest that everyone avoided. What everyone didn't know was who lived inside it. His name was Chief Nkete. Chief Nkete was the richest man for many kilometers in every direction. His name was known in villages that took an entire day to walk. Traders mentioned him. Elders referred him in conversations about what it meant to have enough. Parents used him as an example when they wanted their children to understand that wealth beyond a certain point becomes something else entirely. Something that looked different depending on which direction you approached it. They said his farm stretched so far beyond the hills that a healthy man walking from the moment the sun appeared until the moment disappeared would still not reach the end of them. They said he owned so many cattle that the sound of them moving together in the early morning was like a distant thunder, and his own workers had long given up on counting them accurate. They said his business spread in towns and trading posts that the villagers of Kawere had only heard about in stories. Places where men in suits sat behind tables and moved money the way farmers moved seeds, with the expectation that every seed planted would eventually multiply. His house matched every store. The gates, the carving, the closed window, the silence that surrounded the property even when wind was moving through every other part of the village. But here is the thing that confused people most about Chief Nkete. He did not act like a rich man, not even the way people expected. He did not walk through the villages making sure every eye found him. He did not wear his wealth visibly, did not hang it around his neck, or let it rise his chin when he moved through the path. He did not throw celebrations or invite the important men of neighboring villages to come and admire what he had built. He was quiet, deeply, completely, unsettlingly quiet. The kind of quiet that lives in persons the way water lives in deep ground, invisible from the surface, but always there, always shaping everything above it. He walked slowly, not the slowness of a man who is lazy or tired. It was the slowness of a man who was thinking about something at a very single state, something that nobody else could see, something that did not leave him time to perform for the people around him. He spoke rarely. He used exactly the number of words the situation required, not one more. He smiled, but the smile never quite made all the way to his eyes. It stopped somewhere around his mouth and stayed there, polite and careful and entirely convincing. Some people admired him. They said a man who carried that much wealth without letting it change how he moved through the world was a man worth respecting. Others feared him. They could not explain the fear. They simply felt it, a small cold thing that moved through them when it passed, like a draught from a direction where no window was open. And always, when he had moved far enough down the path that they felt safe speaking, the whispers would begin. There is something wrong with that man. Something has gone. Something went wrong. He has given more to this village than any man I can remember. That is exactly what I mean. Why? Why does he give? Why does a man like that need from people like us? And then some would always say it. The sentence that Kawere had been quietly passing person to person for as long as Chief Nkete had lived in that hill. Riches that come wrapped in silence almost hide a secret. Among the people of Kawere, there was a young woman named Amina. Amina was the daughter of Mama Kwe, and Mama Kwe was the kind of woman that every village needs more of, but somehow always had only one of. She owned very little. A house small enough that you could stand in the center of it and touch two walls. Her garden produced enough for her family and not very much more. Her clothes were clean and carefully kept, but there was nothing about them that anyone would describe as impressive. But Mama Kwe was loved in Kawere, the way the baobab tree at the center of the village was loved. Not for what it gave, exactly, but for the simple, steady fact of its presence, for knowing it was there, for knowing that no matter how difficult things became, it would still be standing in the same place tomorrow. When a child had not eaten, Mama Kwe's house was the house their small feet carried them towards without anyone telling them to go there. When grief arrived in a home and there were no longer any useful words, when the talking was finished and only the sitting remained. Mama Kwe was one who sat quietly without needing to be thanked for it. She had raised Amina with one lesson placed above all others. My child, she had said many times, in many different moments, never measure a person by what they have accumulated. The size of a person's heart will always tell you more about them than the size of anything they own. Amina had taken those words and built them in the foundation of everything she was. She was curious in a way that sometimes made people uncomfortable. The kind of curious does not stop at the surface of things, that keeps pressing gently until the deeper layer is revealed. She was brave in the quiet way that actually costs something, not the loud way that it's partly performance. And she had an intelligence that showed itself not in things she said, but in what she noticed when everyone around her was looking somewhere else. The person who understood all of this about her was Kato. Kato was from Mpewo, a village beyond the western forest, close to Kawere, that the two communities shared certain stories and certain paths, but for enough apart that visiting required intention. He was the kind of young man who approached the world with comfortable assumption that interesting things were always about to happen. He moved through life with a lightness that was not careless. He took things that mattered seriously, but refused that to allow difficult to become heavier than it needed to be. He loved stories, old stories told by people whose voices had earned the depth over many decades. He loved walking places that made other people hesitate and discovering, more often than not, that the things people are afraid of was far less frightening than the fear itself. And he loved Amina with the steady, uncomplicated certainty of a man who had made decision and did not feel the need to revisit it. Whenever he could, he walked the forest past Kawere, not for any reason that required explanation, simply to be near her. One evening, the sun was lowering itself behind the western hills, and the sky was turning the color of firelight. They sat together beside the small river at the edge of the village. The water moved past their feet with unhurried confidence of something that knows exactly where it is going. Amina was not looking at the river. She was looking at the hill, at the house, at the windows that never opened. Kato, she said, her voice barely above the sound of the word. Do you ever actually wonder what happens inside the house? Kato was quiet for a moment. He had the good habit of not filling silence with words just because the silence was there. Many times he finally, and what do you think when you want? Saying that, finally, he looked at the hill. The house sat against the sky like a question someone had written down and then decided not to answer. I think, he says, slowly choosing each word, that a person who guards the interior, that carefully is protecting something real, something that matters, something they are afraid of people seeing. But he hopes people, Amina said. Chief Nkete, he gives, he's known for it. I know. So perhaps the silence is simply who he is. Kato turned to her. Perhaps, he said, or perhaps the giving and the silence are connected in a way we haven't understood yet. Amina looked back at the house. She said nothing more and nothing less. None of them noticed. In the sky had been empty a few minutes before. A strange white cloud moving slowly above the hill, moving towards the house. And then, when it arrived directly above the roof line, stopping completely, sitting there as if it had found the place it had been looking for. Let's link up in part 2 and see what happened after the cloud sat on the house. Please subscribe, like, and share. Thank you.